Hello everyone and welcome to our Facebook Live webinar series. Hello everyone and welcome to our Facebook Live webinar series. My name is Nondumiso Mbubu and I'm a volunteer for Africa for Palestine. We are joined this afternoon by Comrade Tisetso Magama and I'll tell you more about his talk in a minute. But before, let's just start by a little introduction of what Africa for Palestine is. For those that are not familiar with the organization, Africa for Palestine is an organization that focuses on strengthening African-Palestinian relations and pushing back on Israeli apartheid infiltrations and influences into the African continent. We work with solidarity groups, trade unions, political formations, and human rights organizations across the African continent. With the same spirit of progressive internationalization and commitment to sending to the oppressed people of the world as we do. As part of the many programs run by Africa for Palestine, our 30 minutes webinar sessions will be running live on social media platforms. We hope that you will join us, submit your comments, interact with us, and also share topics and speakers you would like us to interview. Today's session is on the imminent Israeli annexation of Palestinian land, what it means and its implications. To take us through, telling us more about the topic is Comrade Magama. Good afternoon. Comrade Magama, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ndumiso.
We're really glad to have you with us. Welcome. So our topic today, for those who just tuned in, is the imminent Israeli annexation of Palestinian land, what it means and its implications. For starters, my question will be, Israel has announced annexation plans for the West Bank. What is annexation?
Well, perhaps for us to understand annexation, Ndumiso, we need to start with the Fourth Geneva Conventions. Now, the Fourth Geneva Conventions was an international agreement that was adopted on 12 August in 1949. This agreement, or this, as we know it, the convention, was adopted by the United Nations in the wake of World War II. And what it tried to do was really to try to circumscribe laws in the event of wars breaking out between nation states. And so the Fourth Geneva Conventions in particular deal specifically issues relating to the laws of war. That is, laws that govern how wars should be fought. They deal with issues of, prisoners of war, how they should be treated, by the state that has taken them prisoner. It deals with issues of annexation. It deals with the general issues of humanitarian, expectations that the international community places on a state that is in a state of conflict with either alike. Now, having said that, so we need to understand that the Fourth Geneva Conventions are a the supreme international instrument, second to the United Nations Charter, that deals with the relations between states and relations between states and their citizens, or citizens of other countries. Now, annexation in terms of the Fourth Geneva Convention is a state acquiring territory during a conflict. That is territory that did not belong to that state prior to that war. Now, in the case of Palestine, for instance, Palestine, the West Bank, indeed, the occupied Palestinian territories, that is the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, are areas which the International Court of Justice, in their opinion, clearly stated that they were occupied territories. They were occupied by a foreign power outside the bounds of international law. You will recall the United Nations adopted Resolution 181 that partitioned Palestine into what would become the state of Israel and Palestine. Now we know, through several conflicts through the years, this indeed morphed into an occupation where now you find Israel occupying large swaths of, in fact, the majority of Palestine. As a matter of fact, not the majority of Palestine. Israel occupies all of Palestine. And so annexation, therefore, in this context specifically, would now be that Israel is in the process of integrating those parts of the West Bank into its own territory. Now that obviously, against the backdrop of international humanitarian law, is illegal by all indications. And as such, Israel will be committing an act of aggression. It will be violating all the norms and standards of international law. But having said that, I think it is important also to distinguish between two types of annexation. At the moment, Israel has, for all practical intents and purposes, as an occupying power, and having built settlements on occupied Palestinian territory, has, for all practical intents and purposes, already annexed those parts of the West Bank, and indeed East Jerusalem. Now that is commonly referred to as, annexation through force, right? You then have another type of annexation, which then now, is annexation through law. In Latin, it's called annexation de jure. Now, de jure is going through the legal steps of actually incorporating it into their own territory as such. So that is, I know, a bit, long explanation, but I think it was important to set the backdrop of international law and what annexation means. So annexation in this case, if Israel were to continue, would be an act of war and an act of aggression.
Thank you for that comment, Magama. But what does it mean for Palestinians?
Well, what it means is that the little, authority that even the Palestinian Authority has will be no more. And now the little authority that I'm talking about, as you would know, at the moment, Israel has delegated security cooperation that is containing, violent fallout coming from the West Bank in particular, through an agreement, of course, the Oslo Accords. That, of course, will be rendered, invalid. The little authority that the Palestinian Authority has in terms of providing social services to those people, they won't be able to do that in any case. But on the ground, what it also means practically is now that those people, especially in the areas of the Jordan River, who will be, affected by this annexation, will be under the direct control of the Israeli forces. Now, again, I think it's important for you to remember, there is at the moment in large measure already an annexation that is, because in the ultimate analysis, Israel is the overlord even over the Palestinian Authority. Israel sends its troops into the West Bank anytime, however they wish. Israel, demolishes Palestinian homes, even in areas that are supposed to be under Palestinian Authority, under the PA's authority. They go around demolishing Palestinian homes. Israel goes and arrests and kills and does whatever it wants within those territories, and in particular the West Bank. So for all practical intents and purposes, Palestine, all of Palestine, has practically been annexed without Israel enacting laws to make that legal in terms of their own law.
So what does this say about the implications for international laws and global governance?
I think there's two responses to that question. One is, I think there must be a realization that Israel has been in flagrant violation of international law since its establishment in 1948, starting with the wholesale massacres and dispossession and displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, commonly known as the Nakba. So that's one level. The second level of it, or perhaps in addition to that, Israel, since its creation, has continued to build settlements in flagrant violation also of international law and indeed the Fourth Geneva Conventions. Because remember, the Fourth Geneva Conventions also prohibits a state from transferring its own population to the newly acquired occupied territory or the area that now they have acquired as a state in a state of conflict, right? So they have been doing that since 1948 in any event, right? That is now also despite the fact that there have been numerous, I mean, year after year after year, in September and in December, we have United Nations General Assembly resolutions and Security Council resolutions, which of course are normally vetoed by the United States, every December. Save for a few years ago, when Obama, for the first time during the last month of his presidency, allowed some mild condemnation of Israel's settlement and other policies against Palestinians. But perhaps also equally importantly is the fact that the United Nations in that Security Council vote reaffirmed the long-standing positions of both the General Assembly and the Security Council on the illegality of settlements. So there is that continuing violation on the one hand. On the other hand, it is a groundbreaking, action, and not in a positive sense. Or perhaps we should put it thus: it's a very radical position taken by Benjamin Netanyahu and Gantz, because you see what essentially they will be doing here is really overstepping the red line that many, even of their own allies, have drawn in the sand. I mean, we know that the European Union has been very clear. They were going to review their position against Israel. They, in fact, are even considering, some sanctions in the event that Israel continues with this illegal annexation. We've heard from other quarters. We know, for instance, also that even within the U.S. Government circles, there is quite a lot of apprehension about Israel taking this step. But what this essentially means is that Israel will, as it has for most of its existence, define itself outside of the bounds of international law. It is already a rogue state that has no regard for law, that has no regard for norms and standards, that has no regard for human and human values, and indeed that has no regard, for people outside of their own constituencies. And so they will be defining themselves really outside the bounds of the international community. I think finally, regarding this question, is then the implications within Palestine are perhaps, from my own analysis, dire. There are, in my view, chances that we may see a third intifada. There are chances that we may see that even those collaborators of Israel in the Middle East, the Arab dictators, in Bahrain, in the UAE, in Saudi, all of them, of course, led by Saudi Arabia. All those sellouts, have made some noises about it. Let's hope that, this will really sober them up and realize that Israel was only able to do this because of their implicit, if not tacit, acceptance.
Okay, speaking of Israeli illegal settlements, would you say that annexation is only now to be legislated, or has it already taken place?
No, look, um, it is clear that Israel, as I said earlier, has already, this annexation was an ongoing process. It's nothing new. I mean, many of us, who've been active in the Palestinian struggle, have been saying this for years, that Israel, this is part of a plan of Israel to eventually annex the occupied Palestinian territories. The settlement expansion, the idea that most people have when you talk about settlements is that, these are some tent, set up where you set up tents and then you move them later. No, no, this is not the case. We know that, these are huge settlement blocks, the sizes of towns and cities. If you take one like Malet Adumim, it's a huge settlement. It's almost a city with everything, with schools and all other social amenities that you can find in any town or city in the world. And so Israel never had any intention of ever leaving those settlements. This much was clear. And so what you find with this annexation is really, I think, analytically, it is bringing the settlement project to its logical conclusion. It wasn't going to go anywhere else in any case. And so what you really see here is Israel simply doing that. But annexation started with settlement expansion. In fact, the very first settlement buildings. And perhaps it's important to know that there is not a single period. You talk to any, you look at the materials of any Israeli, even Israeli historian, there is not a single period in Israel's existence that it ever stopped building settlements from its inception. And so this is bringing, this is really a manifestation of what was commonly referred to as the Eretz Israel project, that is the Greater Israel project. And so that much is clear. And so any hope or any thinking that suggests that Israel will give back those settlements is delusional at the very least, or naive at best.
Surely companies that are complicit, aiding and abetting these settlement industries must be held accountable.
No, for sure. There's no question about it. You see, the important thing is to ensure that there is critical mass. And I think, in a way, Israel's annexation will bring about, or at least will assist in bringing us to that point of reaching critical mass. Now, in light of Israel's actions, even talking about boycott now in Europe, especially in countries like Germany, is becoming more acceptable, when a few months ago, Germany would have nothing to do with boycotts or sanctions. In fact, even went to the extent of banning boycotts of Israel. Of course, thankfully, we know a few weeks ago that ban was overturned by their high court. And so it's illegal in their country to ban boycotts. But this will help to galvanize the international community, to multiply the pressure. But I think what is important for all of us to understand, the resolution of the Palestinian question, ladies and gentlemen, does not lie with governments. The international community is impotent. The international community, Israel has been doing what it's been doing in the face of the international community. It's been violating resolution after resolution, call after call. What more can Israel do? So the international system itself, as represented by its institutions, whether it's the Human Rights Council, whether it's the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council, all of them are important. Differently put, they are useless when coming to bringing a resolution to the Palestinian question. And so the only possibility is for civil society to act, because what we have seen through history is that it is the pressure of civil society that provides governments the incentive to act and act, decisively. We know in our own case, that in the countries like the UK were diametrically opposed to the South African struggle. I mean, the late President Mandela and others were labeled as terrorists. In fact, President Mandela was on the terrorist list of the U.S. government, even during the time when he was president of the republic. I think that was only lifted some years later, a decade or so later, if not earlier. But the important thing is that it is civil society that will ultimately, together, of course, with led by the Palestinians, that will bring about the necessary change. But not our governments, and certainly not the United Nations or any of its agencies.
Speaking of international responses, let's first speak of governments, and we will later discuss civil society. The South African government has said it will rally African countries to oppose the annexation. How do you see this panning out, given South Africa chairing the African Union now?
Well, look, South Africa has always been very consistent on the Palestinian question as a country. South Africa has quite, fraternal, close relations with the Palestinian people. And so we can expect, the government to continue to push that line. Within the African Union, look, we know that Israel has, at least for the past 10 years or so, embarked on a very intensive lobbying drive, lobbying African governments to support them. And we saw statements coming from very important players on the continent: Ethiopia, we've seen Kenya, we've seen Uganda, we've seen now overtures by President Tshisekedi of the DRC, who in fact even attended the APEC conference in the United States. We've seen, a few governments on the African continent, starting to pander. Of course, we also understand, in part, this is also due to the extreme measures that Trump, has imposed on many countries, and his willingness, to act against countries who don't toe the United States line on any matter whatsoever. And of course, Israel is, for reasons still unclear, I think, to most observers of international relations, but Israel is a strategic, perhaps the most important ally of the US for those unknown reasons. And when espoused or expounded, quite illogical, counter US strategic interests, but nonetheless, what they view to be in their interest. And so what you see, therefore, is there's these pressures exerted by the US on African governments, to bow to the US wish of amongst others, supporting Israel within the African Union to take up observer status like Palestine has, but then also, of course, ultimately to overturn, garner enough support within the UN to overturn UN decisions. But I am confident that the African Union has, in fact, since its formation as the OAU in 1963, has been consistent, as well as African countries on the Palestinian question. And so I don't see a fundamental shift there, even if there are attempts But of course, it's important to caution vigilance, not to sit on our laurels, and expect, that our government and other governments will merely act out of goodwill. I think our struggle and other struggles have shown that governments act when they think it's in their own interest, and there is no other interest for a government than its self-perpetuation, than its own continued existence. And so bringing to bear sufficient pressure on our public representatives and governments is very important.
Civil society organizations, especially trade unions, political parties, NGOs, NPOs, and others must take the lead in oppressing Israeli annexations. As you say, the Black Lives Matter is a movement that is an example of what global solidarity can do. Do you see a similar global action?
Look, I think perhaps the link between the two is absolutely crucial. And I don't think, as the Palestine Solidarity Movement internationally, we've sufficiently perhaps understood and therefore built strong linkages, between the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and the Palestine Solidarity Movement on the other. Having said that, the latest developments in the US clearly show us that the political and social consensus that has existed in the US for hundreds of years is indeed fraying at the edges. And the Black Lives Matter movement has, consistently as their theme, had the Palestinian question front and center, in their work. And so what is important is for us to ensure that we build those bridges, between the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and Palestine Solidarity organizations across the world with organizations, in the US, so that we get to a place where we find, where we develop common programs, where we develop common campaigns, especially focused campaigns, to ensure that, we have that multiplier effect on our work globally. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is a very, very, very important, a movement that has emerged in the past 5 years. I think it's important to remember that the Black Lives Matter movement emerged during the presidency of Obama and continued, until now. I think they've been in existence now for about 6 years or 7 years at the most.
In closing, what should be the response from the international community, civil society movements, government, and those people that are watching at home? What call of action should they respond to?
Struggles are hard. We know that from our own experience. I will continue to use our own experience as a point of reference. Struggles are hard. But what brings struggles to their logical conclusion is our ability to build a broad constellation of forces that has sufficient, power to exert on the ruling elites, to exert on businesses. And so I think from our perspective, firstly, as civil society, it is important that we ensure that we push businesses to divest from Israel. We push businesses, in fact, individuals, to boycott Israeli products, in South Africa and of course throughout the world. Because you see, it's important that Israel, pays the price for its occupation and now imminent annexation. Until and unless Israel pays the price, nothing will change. And so it's important that we defund the occupation. But we do that by concerted boycotts, by concerted divestment campaigns, by concerted, sanctions, by pushing governments to implement sanctions own. And I think part of what we need to do is firstly to ensure that the government in South Africa implements their downgrade resolution. You see, what Israel is doing now is they are using the opportunity of countries focusing inward due to the COVID pandemic. And so they are using that, opportunity to hasten and do whatever and complete this or do this annexation. On the other hand, they are also rushing this so that even if Trump leaves at the end of the year, they would have done it, and it would be impossible virtually for the next administration in the US to reverse that decision. And so they're trying to create that irreversible situation. I think on our part, we need to intensify, we need to call on our people to be conscientious consumers, go into shops, look at the products. As soon as it says Israel, simply don't buy the product. We need to engage with our trade unions, do what what they did, refuse to offload Israeli goods on our ports of entry and at our airports and elsewhere. Ensure that our diamonds from De Beers and all these other mines in our country push those companies not to send those diamonds to Israel as they do at the moment. There are these countries like G4S who are still complicit in the occupation, who are the prison warders, and prison builders for Palestinians. We need to make sure that we don't give them business in our country. Those of us who have G4S, in our houses, providing us with security, we must use different companies. And so it's important that at a personal level, first we take responsibility and be conscientious consumers. On the other hand, we need to build that broad constellation of forces with our trade unions and other partners and ensure that we pressurize governments and do the work within the trade union movement. And then, of course, at the level of governments, ensure that, we lobby our governments and the AU and other regional organizations to implement, and sanction Israel. I mean, the international community has sanctioned Russia for the annexation of Crimea. So why the exception to Israel? That's highly hypocritical.
Thank you very much, Comrade Magama. We're glad to have you today in our short webinar. We'd like to thank everyone who tuned in today and listened to our topic as we summarized and unpacked the topic at hand. Thank you very much and goodbye.
No, thank you so much.